Hello everyone and welcome. My name is Rachel Scott and today I will be talking with you briefly about the American Psychological Association's guidelines related to best practices from a multicultural perspective. To do that, we will first be going over the specific guidelines themselves, as well as some additional considerations when thinking about the guidelines. Finally, we will go over a model of conceptualization that is suggested in working with clients by the APA. It is important to note that when referencing clients in these guidelines, they are actually referring to any individual with whom the psychologist works with in a professional capacity. So this can include students, supervisees, research participants, consultation clients, or therapeutic clients. So looking at the specific guidelines themselves, there are 10. And the first guideline states that psychologists should try to recognize and understand that identity and self-definition are fluid and complex, and that there is an interaction between identity and self-definition that is dynamic. Additionally, it's important to know that the client's social context can end up influencing this interaction. The second guideline states that psychologists should try to recognize and understand that they themselves are cultural beings, which means that their attitudes and beliefs can influence their perceptions of and interactions with others, as well as their clinical and empirical conceptualizations. Additionally, psychologists should strive to move past any kind of categorical assumptions, biases, or formulations that they may have about clients based on potentially limited knowledge about individuals and the communities with which they belong. The third guideline states that psychologists should strive to recognize and understand the role of language and communication through increased sensitivity to the lived experiences of the client. Additionally, it's important to understand one's own language and communication styles and how this may influence the interactions with clients. The fourth guideline states that psychologists should strive to be aware of the role of the social and physical environments of the clients. The fifth guideline states that psychologists should try to recognize and understand the historical and contemporary experiences with power, privilege, and oppression that they and their clients may experience. They should try to address any institutional barriers and related inequities, disproportionalities, and disparities of law enforcement, administration of criminal justice, education, mental health, and other systems in an attempt to promote justice, human rights, and access to quality and equitable mental and behavioral health services. The sixth guideline states that psychologists should seek to promote culturally adaptive interventions and advocacy within and across systems, which may include prevention measures, early interventions, and throughout the recovery. The seventh guideline states that psychologists should endeavor to examine the profession's assumptions and practices within an international context. It's also important to consider how the globalization of this process may have an impact on the psychologist's self-definition, purpose, role, and function within the profession. The eighth guideline states that psychologists should seek awareness and understanding of how developmental stages and life transitions may intersect with the larger biosociocultural context of the client. Additionally, they should also understand how identity evolves as a function of these intersections and how different socialization and maturation experiences may influence the client's worldview and identity. The ninth guideline states that psychologists should strive to conduct culturally appropriate and informed research, teaching, supervision, consultation, assessment, interpretation, diagnosis, dissemination, and evaluation of efficacy in all professional practices. And the final guideline states that psychologists should strive to take a strength-based approach when working with clients, as well as attempt to build resiliency and decrease trauma within the sociocultural context. There are some additional considerations that should be addressed before moving on to a discussion of the model that is suggested by the APA. It is important to note that these are guidelines and not standards. Standards are mandates to which all psychologists should adhere, whereas guidelines are aspirational and informative regarding practice considerations. So therefore, these are suggested guidelines, but they are not necessarily enforceable. However, everyone should strive to try and utilize these within their regular practice. Additionally, it is of note that the original multicultural guidelines, created in 2002, only addressed racial and ethnic issues, whereas these updated guidelines from 2017 address additional group identities such as culture, language, gender, ability status, sexual orientation, age, socioeconomic status, and more. Further, the guidelines also define cultural competence as not necessarily ending when a psychologist is found to be generally competent, but instead is a lifelong humility process which involves reflection and commitment to practicing from a multicultural perspective. Finally, we can now begin to discuss the suggested model for conceptualization of clients from a multicultural perspective. In the 1970s, a researcher by the name of Bronfenbrenner proposed a model suggesting how an individual is influenced by various surrounding systems. Immediately outside of the individual is the microsystem, which has an immediate direct influence on the individual. This includes family, friends, teachers, and institutions. Beyond the microsystem is the mesosystem, which is made up of interrelated social entities from the microsystem. This includes the home, school, community, and other larger institutions. Beyond the mesosystem is the exosystem, which is made up of societal and cultural forces that influence the individual. However, there is not necessarily a direct link to the individual's experiences. Beyond this is the macrosystem, which is the general cultural context in which the individual lives. This encompasses cultural values and norms, as well as laws and governmental influences. And finally, there's the chronosystem, which is the general historical context. This includes the passage of time, historical trends and transitions, and the context surrounding individual experiences. Within clinical work, psychologists tend to focus on intrapersonal factors, but also may choose to address microsystem and mesosystem interactions, as these are often entities that influence the individual's intrapersonal experience. In consultation work, the exosystem and macrosystems are often the targets. However, psychologists are encouraged to consider the macrosystem throughout all forms of work, as the general cultural context does influence the individual. Finally, it is important to consider the chronosystem, especially in an instance where the psychologist and client may have a generational gap, as the client may have lived through historical events that the psychologist may not have. Finally, we get to the current model proposed by the Multicultural Guidelines. This model is heavily influenced by the Bronfenbrenner model, which will become quite clear as we discuss it. Starting in the middle of the model, we see two circles with a bidirectional relationship between. This signifies the individual's self-definition of both the client and the clinician. This is a bidirectional relationship to indicate that there are interactions between, and the relationship between client and clinician do impact each other. Surrounding circles represent successively expanding sources of influence. Going beyond level 1 of that bidirectional relationship is level 2, encompassing community, school, and family context. This does have a direct influence on level 1. This represents the micro and meso systems. Beyond level 2, level 3 represents institutional impact on engagement. This includes systems such as government, medical, legal, mental and behavioral health, and educational systems. The next level is level 4, which encompasses the domestic and international climate, as well as the larger societal context. Within larger societal context, as indicated at the bottom of the model, are the human rights of the individual. So it is important to ask, are human rights being compromised by domestic or international climates? Finally, the last level represents outcomes. These are both positive and negative potential outcomes that result from that bidirectional transaction between the clinician and client, as indicated by the bidirectional arrows between level 5 and level 1, as well as at the different levels throughout the model. There are a number of dynamic processes that influence the model and are represented by the dotted line surrounding level 5. The first of these dynamic processes includes power and privilege. This is a continuum that is experienced by all individuals included within the model. It is important for clinicians to recognize how social power and privilege in relation to the client may affect the bidirectional relation at level 1 as well as throughout every level. The second dynamic process encompasses tensions that may be felt throughout the levels. This tension could be felt between the levels, or it could be within level 1. There are multiple intersections and interactions for tension. It is essential to examine these tensions throughout the model and not just at the intrapersonal level. Finally, the last dynamic process includes fluidity, which is an interaction between the levels and shifts within the levels as well. It is important to consider changes in relationship patterns, life events and transitions, contextual influences, the passage of time, and the influence of one's own internal experiences throughout the professional relationship. Finally, it is important to recognize that through the promotion of healing, learning, knowledge through research, and collaborations through consultation, a client's resiliency can be increased and their trauma decreased. The purpose of this model is to expand the conceptualization of clients beyond interpersonal concerns and instead consider how the professional relationship, influential contexts, and dynamic forces can all impact the client's outcomes. Psychologists must consider the intersectionality of context to better conceptualize a client's presenting concern. If you would like additional information regarding the APA's guidelines about multicultural practices, please visit their website as listed. Additionally, you can email me at rks256@msstate.edu.